The family secret that tore us apart. A reunion gone wrong. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. As the projector illuminated my father's secret family on the dining room wall, the room went dead silent. The only sound left in the entire world was the violent, relentless lashing of the heavy rain against the massive bay windows of the isolated lake house. I stood frozen at the head of the long oak table, my hand still gripping the remote control so tightly my knuckles were completely white. To my left, my mother, Helen, sat perfectly still, her eyes wide and unblinking as she stared at the high-definition image of her husband of 40 years holding a toddler who looked exactly like him, standing next to a woman who wasn't her. The crystal wine glass she had been holding just seconds before lay shattered in a dozen jagged pieces on the hardwood floor, the dark red Cabernet pooling like blood around the pristine white tablecloth. I am Iris. For 29 years, I have been the designated family peacekeeper. I am the one who remembers every birthday, the one who smooths over every political argument at Thanksgiving, the one who meticulously organized this lavish, weekend-long family reunion to celebrate my parents' milestone anniversary. I was the glue holding this family together, desperate to maintain the flawless, respectable image my father, Arthur, had spent his entire life carefully constructing. Look around your own family table. What do you do when the man you idolize is a complete stranger? Across the room, my older brother, David, the golden child who practically worshipped the ground our father walked on, was rapidly blinking, his face contorting from confusion into a terrifying, defensive rage. And then there was my father, Arthur, the patriarch, the man of absolute integrity. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking dead at me. The mask of the benevolent, loving father had completely melted away, replaced by something cold, calculating, and viciously cornered. The air in the room felt impossibly thick, completely suffocating, as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the enormous rented estate. Everything I thought I knew about my identity, my parents' marriage, and my own history was evaporating in real time. But to understand how this nightmare happened, I have to take you back. It all started 6 months earlier, back when the illusion of my parents' perfect 40-year marriage was still entirely intact. My father, Arthur, was a retired corporate executive, a man who commanded absolute respect simply by walking into a room. He was obsessed with his legacy, always talking about the importance of the family name, reputation, and honor. My mother, Helen, was his devoted shadow. She was slightly oblivious to the harsh realities of the world, having spent 4 decades entirely dependent on him for everything from financial security to her own sense of self-worth. To the outside world, and to David and me, they were the absolute gold standard of matrimony. They held hands on walks. They hosted charity dinners. They were untouchable. Because of this towering pedestal they sat on, the pressure I felt to make this Ruby anniversary weekend absolutely flawless was crushing me. I had spent countless hours scrolling through luxury rental sites before finally securing a sprawling, isolated estate on the edge of a deep, dark lake. I planned catered dinners, wine tastings, and boat rides. But the crown jewel of the entire weekend was supposed to be the digital tribute video. I wanted to gather every photograph, every home movie, and every well-wish from extended family to create a sweeping documentary of their love story. I was so incredibly naive, so desperate for a perfect family dynamic that I ignored the subtle, creeping exhaustion in my mother's eyes whenever my father casually dismissed her opinions. I spent weeks scanning dusty photo albums and begging my dad for access to his old desktop computer to retrieve some digital files he had saved from the early 2000s. He initially resisted, making jokes about his lack of technological organization, but my persistent nagging finally wore him down. He gave me the password, casually telling me the photos were in a folder on the main screen. I promised him I would only take the pictures and leave the rest of his boring retirement documents alone. I truly meant it. I had absolutely no intention of snooping through his private life. If I had just stayed out of his files, maybe we would still be a family. I was sitting on the floor of my cramped apartment, surrounded by external hard drives and empty coffee cups, compiling the digital tribute video. I was knee-deep in photos of my parents' trips to Europe, David's college graduation, and my own awkward middle school phases. I needed a few more candid shots of my dad from the late 90s to balance out the montage, so I dug deeper into his old digital directories. That was when I stumbled upon a hidden, password-protected folder buried deep within a mundane tax directory. The folder was simply titled J.R. Expenses. At first, I didn't think much of it. My father had managed dozens of accounts and properties during his corporate career. But as I tried to back out of the folder, my laptop glitched, and a preview pane rendered a few of the files inside. They weren't business receipts. They were recurring monthly bank transfers, highly consistent, dating back literally decades. And next to the financial documents was a subfolder containing a few isolated JPGs. The thumbnail of one image caught my eye. It looked like my father, but he was wearing a casual baseball cap I'd never seen, standing in front of a modest suburban house that definitely wasn't ours. I squinted at the screen, my heart doing a strange, fluttering skip. A name kept popping up in the memo lines of the transfer receipts. Julian. Who on earth is Julian? I wondered. I logically tried to convince myself it was a contractor, a former employee, or maybe even a charity case my dad was quietly supporting to boost his ego. I forcefully brushed the anomaly off, closing the folder and taking a deep breath. I was the peacekeeper, not a private investigator. I told myself that every successful man has complicated finances, and it was none of my business. I intentionally buried the creeping feeling of dread that was starting to pool in my stomach. I went back to editing the video, layering a sweet, acoustic song over a photo of my parents cutting their wedding cake. I convinced myself it was nothing, completely ignoring my own screaming intuition. The fatal error happened 2 weeks before the reunion. I was exhausted, staying up until 3 in the morning trying to finalize the massive digital invite list for the weekend's welcome dinner. I had exported a massive CSV file of contacts from my dad's old digital address book, intending to send out a beautiful, templated email with the itinerary, directions to the lake house, and dress code. I was running entirely on fumes and caffeine. I quickly skimmed the list, deleting obvious business contacts, but in my sleep-deprived haze, I hit select all on the extended family group and clicked send. I didn't realize that the old address book had automatically merged a hidden contact list into the main export. 3 days later, I was sitting at my desk when an RSVP notification popped up in my inbox. It read, Julian R. has accepted your invitation. He had added a brief, polite note. So glad to finally be included in a family gathering. See you at the lake as a distant cousin. My blood instantly ran completely cold. Julian, the name from the hidden expense folder. The name attached to decades of secret bank transfers. I stared at the screen, my mouth completely dry, a sickening realization washing over me. I had accidentally invited my father's secret to the reunion. I immediately picked up my phone and called my dad. The second he answered, I casually mentioned the RSVPs and brought up the name Julian, asking which side of the family this distant cousin belonged to. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, deafening, and completely terrifying. When my father finally spoke, his usually booming, confident voice was entirely hollowed out, reduced to a desperate, frantic whisper. He demanded to know exactly what I had sent, who else was coming, and why I had gone digging into his contacts. He wasn't just annoyed. He was in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. He told me to cancel the reservation immediately, blaming his suddenly failing health. But it was too late. The deposit was paid, and the family was already on their way. The weekend began exactly as the weather forecast had predicted, with a dark, suffocating, torrential downpour. The rented lake house, which had looked so charming and expansive in the online photos, suddenly felt incredibly isolated and claustrophobic. The heavy rain lashed relentlessly against the glass, trapping 25 extended relatives indoors. The air was thick with the smell of wet coats, expensive catered food, and forced smiles. I buzzed around the living room, pouring wine and laughing loudly, desperately trying to play the perfect hostess while a massive knot of anxiety tightened painfully in my chest. Then, the heavy oak front door swung open, letting in a howling gust of wind and rain. A man stepped into the foyer, shaking the water from his dark jacket. He was 32, tall, and carried himself with a quiet, observant stillness. He introduced himself to my Aunt Sarah as Julian, a second cousin on my father's side from out of state. I watched him from across the room, feeling the blood completely drain from my face. The eerie, undeniable physical resemblance to my father sent absolute chills down my spine. He had the exact same sharp jawline, the same piercing, assessing dark eyes, and the exact same way of tilting his head when he listened. My brother, David, completely oblivious, walked over and warmly shook Julian's hand, offering him a beer. I watched as my father entered the foyer from the kitchen. Arthur stopped dead in his tracks. For a fraction of a second, the great patriarch looked entirely small, terrified, and violently pale. Julian locked eyes with my father, a slow, incredibly cold, and knowing smile spreading across his face. It was the smile of a predator who had finally cornered his prey after years of waiting. The tension in the room spiked so drastically I felt like I couldn't breathe, the walls of the lake house seemingly closing in around us. I knew right then that this man was definitely not my second cousin. The first evening dragged on in a blur of clinking glasses and loud, overlapping conversations. I watched Julian like a hawk. He was incredibly charismatic, seamlessly integrating himself into the family dynamic, making my mother laugh with a charming anecdote, and complimenting David on his recent promotion. But underneath the polite veneer, I could see the sharp edges of his resentment. During a lull in the conversation by the fireplace, my Uncle Robert was reminiscing about a terrible blizzard in 1994, mentioning how my dad had been trapped out of state on a business trip in Chicago. Julian, swirling his bourbon, stared directly at my father and casually remarked, "Chicago? That's funny, Arthur. I thought you always preferred the mild winters of upstate New York, especially around December." The room went quiet for a brief second. It was a highly specific, incredibly cryptic comment that a distant cousin should not possibly know. My father's knuckles turned white around his glass. He forced a hollow laugh, muttering something about corporate schedules, but his eyes were filled with absolute, murderous panic. Have you ever seen a powerful man realize his entire life is a house of cards? 10 minutes later, I was walking down the dimly lit hallway toward the downstairs bathroom when I heard harsh, urgent whispering coming from the study. I pressed my back against the wall, holding my breath. The door was cracked open just an inch. Through the sliver of space, I saw my father violently grab Julian by the arm, pulling him out of the light. "Are you insane?" my dad hissed, his voice trembling with a rage I had never heard before. "What do you want? I told you I would handle this." Julian smoothly pulled his arm away, entirely unbothered. "You've had 30 years to handle it, Dad. Time's up." The word "Dad" echoed in my ears like a deafening gunshot. The next morning, the storm intensified, canceling the planned boat tour. While the rest of the family gathered in the massive living room for a noisy, chaotic brunch, I slipped away. My heart was pounding frantically against my ribs as I crept upstairs to the master suite. My father had left his leather briefcase sitting on the velvet armchair. I knew I was crossing a massive moral line, but the desperate need for the truth completely overpowered my guilt. My hands physically shook as I undid the brass clasps and pulled out a stack of documents hidden beneath his golf magazines. I found a sealed, manila envelope. Inside was the horrifying, undeniable truth. There were dozens of high-quality printed photographs spanning 3 decades. My father at a different hospital holding a newborn. My father at a different Little League game. My father standing proudly next to Julian at his high school graduation, looking happier and more relaxed than I had ever seen him. Beneath the photos were neatly filed bank statements detailing aggressive, massive cash withdrawals, and a certified copy of Julian's birth certificate. The father's name printed cleanly on the government document was Arthur Thomas Vance. I sank onto the thick carpet, the air completely leaving my lungs. It wasn't just a brief, terrible affair. It was an entire, parallel existence. He had been living a double life for 32 years, splitting his time, his money, and his affection. While I was desperately trying to be the perfect daughter to earn his approval, he was secretly raising a second family just 3 hours away. The betrayal was so deep, so profoundly sickening, that I felt physically nauseous. I stared at the birth certificate, the solid proof of my father's monstrous deception, realizing that my mother's entire marriage was nothing but an elaborate, cruel stage play. But as I dug deeper into the briefcase, I found something infinitely worse. Beneath the birth certificate lay a thick, legally binding folder from a prominent wealth management firm. I quickly scanned the heavy legalese, my eyes darting over the numbers. It was a massive, recently executed loan agreement. The terrifying reality hit me like a physical blow. My father hadn't just been secretly funding a second family out of his surplus income to buy Julian's absolute silence ahead of this high-profile anniversary weekend. My father had been forced to pay an exorbitant, ruinous sum of hush money. To get that kind of liquid cash quietly, he had secretly remortgaged my mother's ancestral family home, the beautiful, sprawling estate she had inherited from her own parents and planned to leave to David and me. He had forged her signature on the secondary loan documents, leveraging her entire legacy to cover his own tracks. The numbers on the page were staggering. My mother, who thought she was living securely in a paid-off dream home, was actually entirely bankrupt, unknowingly sitting on a mountain of high-interest debt she could never hope to repay at 63. The depth of his absolute selfishness was staggering. He wasn't just a cheater. He was a financial predator willing to completely destroy his devoted wife's future just to protect his own flawless public image for a few more years. I sat there in the dim light of the bedroom, clutching the papers, realizing the terrifying scope of the catastrophe. If I exposed him, I would break my mother's heart and humiliate her in front of everyone she loved. But if I stayed silent, I would be entirely complicit in her financial ruin and emotional manipulation. The walls of the lake house felt like a prison closing in around me. I carefully put the documents back, knowing exactly what I had to do next. I was physically sick, violently throwing up in the master bathroom before splashing freezing water on my pale face. I had to get away from the suffocating noise of my family. I texted Julian, demanding he meet me down at the boathouse immediately. The rain was pounding against the tin roof of the old wooden shed when he finally swaggered in, looking entirely too calm for a man dismantling a family. "Nice party, Iris," he said dryly, leaning against a dusty kayak. I didn't waste time. I told him I had seen the briefcase, the photos, and the loan documents. I told him I knew exactly who he was and what my father had done. Julian didn't even flinch. He just nodded slowly, a bitter, exhausted look crossing his face. "He told my mother he was going to leave Helen when I was born," Julian explained, his voice tight with decades of suppressed anger. "Then he said he'd do it when I turned 10, then 18. He kept us a dirty little secret, throwing money at us to stay hidden in the shadows while you and David got to be the proud, public children." He looked at me, not with hatred, but with a cold, terrifying determination. "I didn't come here to be part of your family, Iris. I came here to watch him squirm, and to claim the respect I am finally owed." I pleaded with him, begging him to leave my innocent mother out of this, explaining that the remortgage would literally destroy her. Julian scoffed coldly. "She's wearing a $40,000 necklace while my mother died in a rented apartment, Iris. I don't care about her feelings." I realized then that I couldn't control Julian, and I couldn't protect my mother from the fallout. I had to choose between being the peacekeeper who enabled a monster or the executioner who blew the entire family apart. I stood alone in the damp boathouse, the heavy rain masking my quiet sobs. I wiped my tears, knowing the illusion had to end tonight. I walked back into the main house, completely drenched and shivering, trying to slip unnoticed into the kitchen to grab a towel. But my father was waiting for me. He stood by the massive marble island, the perfect father act completely dropped. His eyes were cold, calculating, and utterly terrifying. He had clearly noticed me hovering near his briefcase earlier. "You always were too nosy for your own good, Iris," he said softly, stepping closer to me so his voice wouldn't carry into the dining room. "I know what you saw, and I know you're smart enough to keep your mouth completely shut." I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs. "You stole Mom's house," I whispered fiercely, my voice trembling with disgust. "You lied to us our entire lives." Arthur leaned in, his imposing frame blocking the doorway, using the vicious emotional blackmail he had perfected over decades. "If you breathe a word of this, you will completely destroy your mother. Her mental health won't survive the humiliation. David will hate you forever for ruining the family. You will be the one who broke us, Iris, not me. You will carry that guilt for the rest of your miserable life." He was entirely right. I knew my mother's fragile constitution. I knew David's blind loyalty. My father was expertly weaponizing my own deep-seated need to protect the family against me. He smiled smoothly, patting my wet shoulder with chilling affection. Go dry off, sweetie. The anniversary dinner starts in an hour. It's going to be a beautiful evening. He turned and walked out, leaving me trapped in the kitchen, paralyzed by fear and crushing responsibility. The weight of his horrific secret was crushing the breath out of me. But as I looked at the tribute video flash drive on the counter, my fear finally turned to rage. It was the final night, the grand anniversary dinner. The storm outside had escalated into a full-blown tempest, keeping everyone trapped entirely indoors. The massive dining room was painfully beautiful, lit by dozens of flickering candles, the long oak table covered in crystal, silver, and expensive floral arrangements. My mother looked so incredibly happy, her eyes shining with unshed tears as she looked around at the family she believed was perfect. I sat at the far end of the table, my stomach completely tied in agonizing knots, watching Julian sit quietly across from David, waiting for the inevitable explosion. David stood up, tapping his crystal wine glass with a silver spoon. The room instantly quieted down. He raised his glass, looking directly at our father with sickeningly blind adoration. To Dad, David began, his voice thick with emotion. A man of absolute integrity. A man who taught me what it means to be loyal, to protect the people you love, and to always put family first. You and Mom are the ultimate inspiration to us all. Everyone raised their glasses, murmuring agreements, their faces glowing in the candlelight. I looked at my father, watching him accept the praise with a humble, sickeningly fake smile. I felt the heavy flash drive burning a hole in my pocket. I had spent the last hour rapidly editing the tribute video, deleting the acoustic songs and the happy vacation photos, replacing them with the raw, brutal truth I had photographed from his briefcase. As David finished his toast and called for the video to begin, I stood up on shaky legs. I walked over to the laptop connected to the high-definition projector, my hands trembling violently. My father caught my eye, shooting me a sharp, terrifying warning glare that promised absolute ruin if I defied him. I ignored him, plugged in the drive, and hit play. As the projector illuminated my father's secret family on the dining room wall, the room went dead silent. There was no sweet acoustic music. The first image was a massive, high-definition scan of Julian's birth certificate, the name Arthur Thomas Vance, glowing brightly in stark black and white. A collective, confused gasp echoed through the room. Aunt Sarah squinted, clearly trying to understand the document. Then, the slide changed. It was a recent photograph of my father, his arm wrapped lovingly around Julian at a restaurant, both of them laughing heartily. The confusion in the room instantly curdled into absolute, terrifying shock. I hit the spacebar again. The screen filled with the loan documents, the highlighted sections showing the remortgage of my mother's family estate, and the forged signature. My mother, Helen, let out a sound I will never, ever forget, a wounded, hollow, animalistic keen that completely shattered the silence. The crystal wine glass slipped from her trembling hand, crashing to the floor and exploding into a dozen jagged pieces, the dark red Cabernet pooling on the pristine rug. "What is this?" David yelled, violently kicking his chair back, his face completely pale. "Iris, turn that off. What kind of sick joke is this?" He lunged toward the laptop, but Julian calmly stood up, blocking his path. "It's not a joke, David," Julian said, his voice echoing coldly in the cavernous room. "It's just the truth. I'm your brother." My father leaped from his seat, his face purple with absolute rage, entirely abandoning his composed facade. The mask had completely slipped, revealing the terrified, desperate monster underneath. The dining room instantly erupted into pure, uncontrollable chaos. The screaming was deafening. My Aunt Sarah was sobbing violently, trying to pull my catatonic mother out of the room. David, entirely unable to process the destruction of his idol, violently shoved Julian. Julian didn't hit back. He just laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that echoed over the thunder outside. 30 years of lies, Arthur." Julian shouted over the chaos. Tell them how you paid me off." My father, cornered and completely unhinged, pointed a shaking finger directly at my weeping mother. "I did this because of you." My father roared, his voice laced with venomous cruelty. "You were suffocating me. You were weak, and you demanded too much. I needed an escape." The entire room froze in utter horror at his viciousness. He was actually blaming the woman he had betrayed and bankrupted for his own monstrous actions. David, entirely broken, turned on me instead. "You did this," my brother screamed, his face completely red, tears streaming down his cheeks. "You ruined everything. You couldn't just leave it alone. You had to destroy the family." I stood there by the projector, the harsh light illuminating the devastation I had unleashed. I had wanted the truth out, but watching my mother physically collapse into my aunt's arms, completely broken and destroyed, made me feel incredibly sick to my stomach. My father stormed out of the dining room, grabbing his coat and walking out into the torrential rain, leaving us all behind in the wreckage of his lies. The perfect family I had spent my entire life trying to protect was completely, irreparably dead, shattered like the glass on the floor. I knew the hardest part was only just beginning. The immediate days following the reunion were a complete and utter blur of lawyers, screaming matches, and devastating financial revelations. The family completely fractured. Half of the extended relatives entirely blamed me for ruining my parents' twilight years, aggressively insisting I should have kept the secret to protect my mother's dignity. David completely cut me out of his life, unable to face the reality of who our father truly was. He preferred to live in the comfortable, familiar lie, completely cutting ties with me to maintain his own fragile worldview. The legal fallout was an absolute nightmare. Because of the massive, hidden debts and the fraudulent loan, the sprawling ancestral estate my mother loved so dearly had to be immediately sold to avoid total foreclosure. We spent weeks packing up 40 years of memories into cold, brown cardboard boxes. My father hired a vicious, expensive divorce attorney, attempting to drag my mother through the mud to protect his remaining assets, though his public reputation in their wealthy social circle was completely and utterly annihilated. He became a social pariah overnight. Julian got his hush money, but he didn't get the family connection he secretly craved. After the explosion at the lake house, he vanished back into his own life, a ghost who had successfully detonated a bomb and walked away from the crater. I was left entirely alone to pick up the broken pieces of my mother's shattered life, spending my evenings on the phone with aggressive debt collectors and weeping relatives. The guilt of being the one who pulled the trigger weighed heavily on my chest every single day. But amidst the absolute ruin, something profound began to shift. It has been 2 years since the disaster at the lake house. We are living an entirely different life now. I moved my mother into a small, cozy 2-bedroom apartment down the street from my place. It isn't a massive, sprawling estate, and it doesn't have a grand dining room, but it is filled with completely honest, genuine peace. Therapy has slowly helped my mother realize that her worth was never tied to my father's wealth or his toxic, conditional approval. She has started painting again, a hobby Arthur had mocked for decades. I learned the incredibly painful lesson that you cannot be the peacekeeper for people who are actively at war with the truth. Protecting a toxic lie to maintain a comfortable illusion is entirely different from protecting your family. Dignity doesn't come from a perfect public image. It comes from having the absolute courage to face the ugly, painful reality and choosing to rebuild on a foundation of honesty. I lost my father, my brother, and my family home, but I finally saved myself from the exhausting, suffocating burden of carrying their secrets. Looking back, the destruction was absolutely necessary. We had to burn the toxic, rotting house down to the ground to finally be free of the ghosts living inside it. If you are sitting on a family secret, entirely terrified of the fallout, know this: the explosion will hurt, and the fire will burn everything you know. But the absolute relief of never having to lie again is worth every single piece of shattered glass. Sometimes, the only way to heal is to let it all fall apart.